The language is almost always about how we must export. And what's really good is an industry that produces exports. And if we buy from abroad and import, that's bad. But surely that's just upside down as well. What we send abroad, we can't eat, we can't wear, we can't use for our houses. The goods and services we send abroad are goods and services not available to us. On the other hand, the goods and services we import, they provide us with TV sets we can watch, with automobiles we can drive, with all sorts of nice things for us to use. The gain from foreign trade is what we import. What we export is the cost of getting those imports. And the proper objective for a nation, as Adam Smith put it, is to arrange things so we get as large a volume of imports as possible for as small a volume of exports as possible. When people talk about a favorable balance of trade, what is that term taken to mean? It's taken to mean that we export more than we import. But from the point of view of our well-being, that's an unfavorable balance. That means we're sending out more goods and getting fewer in. Each of you in your private household would know better than that. You don't regard it as a favorable balance when you have to send out more goods to get less coming in. It's favorable when you can get more by sending out less. This tendency to concentrate on the productive side of our lives and to neglect the side of consumption is reinforced by the fact that even for the productive side of our lives, the visible effects of tariffs are good, the invisible effects of tariffs are bad, even on the productive side. It's perfectly clear that if you restrict the imports of steel, there are some workers in the steel industry who will have jobs they otherwise would not have. The beneficial effects for them of a tariff is perfectly clear. But if we import less steel, foreigners earn fewer dollars. They have fewer dollars to spend in this country. There are people around the country who will not have jobs, not have productive jobs, but that's invisible. The people who might have been producing goods to sell abroad don't know they might have had that job. So, out of sight, out of mind. And as a result, on both the side of consumption and the side of producers, you have the concentrated special interest versus the diffuse general interest. But then you will say to me, what's wrong with all these fine arguments I hear? What's wrong with the arguments by George Meany at the AFL-CIO convention that the high-wage American workers are being unfairly competed against by the low-wage foreign workers, that we have to protect our American workers and their standard of living from the competition of foreigners in Japan or Korea or somewhere else who are willing to work for much less than the American worker. What's wrong with that argument? Well, in the first place, what does a high wage and a low wage mean? The Japanese worker is paid in yen. The American worker is paid in dollars. How do I know how many dollars equals how many yen? Let me go at this a little more indirectly. You can see the fallacy in this argument, I think, most clearly by taking a very, very extreme case. Let's take the most extreme case of all. Let's suppose that at the existing exchange rate, whatever it is, Japan, to take the example which is a favorite whipping boy, Japan could undersell us in everything. That a Japanese can produce whatever you name across the board, from wheat and soybeans to television sets and automobiles. more cheaply than we can. And let's see what would happen. We'd rush to buy them. The Japanese sellers would be paid for them in dollars. What would they do with the dollars? Nothing for them to buy in the United States, because by assumption, everything's cheaper in Japan. What then would they do with the dollars? If they would be willing to burn them up, oh, that'd be wonderful. After all, there is no product we can produce more cheaply than green pieces of paper. But of course, the Japanese are not going to do that. They aren't going to work and produce goods and send them over here in order to get pieces of paper which they're going to burn up. They want to get goods and services. And when they discover that there are no American goods and services that are cheaper than those in Japan, they will say, well, gee, I better convert these dollars back into yen. But who's going to sell them yen? Why would anybody sell them yen? Because here, if I have yen, I can buy the Japanese goods by assumption more cheaply. So nobody would be willing to sell yen. Well, let's suppose to begin with, the price, the rate of exchange between the dollar and the yen was, as it was for a long time, 360 yen to the dollar, or $1 would buy 360 yen. Well, then these people who had all these dollars that were useless to them would say, gee, if you'll sell me some yen, I'll give you $1 for 300 yen. No, says the owner of the yen. Even at 300 yen to the dollar, American goods are too expensive. They're not worth it. Okay, I'll give you $1 for 200 yen. And you can see what would happen. The price of the yen would be bid up until what? Well, the fewer yen you get for $1, the more expensive Japanese goods are to Americans. The more dollars you get for a yen, the cheaper American goods are to Japanese. And so the effect of this would have to be that the yen would rise in price until it was no longer true that all U.S. goods were more expensive than all Japanese goods. Because as the yen became more expensive, Japanese goods would become more expensive to U.S. citizens in dollars, and American goods would become cheaper to Japanese in yen. And that would continue until roughly, on the average, the amount of goods, the dollar value of the goods that the Japanese would buy in the United States would be roughly equal to the dollar value of the goods that the U.S. would sell. And at that point, the price of the yen in terms of the dollar would be at an appropriate level. Now, I've simplified the story because over and above these bilateral transactions between the United States and Japan, of course, these flows of trade will take roundabout directions. The Japanese will spend some of their dollars in Brazil, and the Brazilians, in turn, will spend their dollars in the U.S., and the dollars may flow in very roundabout circuits. But the principle is the same. People want dollars, not in order to have pieces of paper, but in order to have U.S. or other goods. And again, the actual situation is complicated by the fact that in addition to the flows of goods and services, there are also capital flows, also investments abroad. The United States, throughout the 19th century, throughout the period when we were building up and getting to be the economically most developed country in the world, the United States had a balance of payments deficit, trade deficit every single year, almost. Why? Because the U.S. was a country in which foreigners wanted to invest capital. The British were producing goods and sending them over to us in return for pieces of paper. Not those green pieces of paper, but different pieces of paper, bonds, promising to pay back a sum of money at a later time plus interest on it. And the British regarded that as a good investment, and they regarded it, therefore, as worth their while to send us goods in order to get those pieces of paper. And there was nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, we benefited by having foreign investment here that enabled us to develop more rapidly, and the British benefited by getting a higher yield on their savings than they could have gotten any other way. In the 20th century, that was reversed. We had what this was called a favorable balance of trade because the U.S. citizens were finding that they could get a higher return for their money by investing abroad than they could at home. And as a result, we were sending goods abroad in return for those pieces of paper. Again, in the post-World War II world, under American foreign aid and Marshall Plan programs, we were making gifts abroad. We were sending goods and services abroad as an expression of our belief that that was a contribution to a peaceful world. So the situation is more complicated. But the fundamental point is the same. So long as you have a free exchange rate, which is free to determine in the market the price of the dollar in terms of the yen, there is no balance of payments problem. There is no sense in which American industry is in danger of being undercut by foreign industries and destroyed. Let me put the matter to you a little differently. Suppose on the average, an American worker is roughly twice as productive as the average Japanese worker. That's roughly what the situation is. On the average, the American worker takes home from his work, as pay for his activities, a sum of money which will buy about twice as large a basket of goods as his Japanese counterpart can buy. If that's the case, we cannot afford, well, that's a little exaggeration. We should not use any American worker in an activity in which he's less than twice as efficient. This is what was dubbed 150 years ago in the jargon of economics the principle of comparative advantage. We may be more efficient in everything than the Japanese. That doesn't mean it pays us to produce everything at home. We should concentrate on our efforts on those activities in which we are the most efficient. Let me put it to you in a simple way. In a domestic illustration, I have a lawyer who's a very good typist. Does that mean he should dispense with his secretary and type his own letters? He may be a better typist than his secretary. But if he's only 1.5 times as good a typist, but 5 times as good a lawyer, both he and his secretary are better off if he concentrates on doing the law and she concentrates on typing the letters. Or, in this day and age, I should say, she concentrates on doing the law and he concentrates on typing the letters.